Thank you for joining us at XM.com for this special report. We're just days before we say goodbye to 2019, and we'll be having a look at the year ahead for major currencies. I'm Christina Marujos. Joining me today is Mario Sotikiriakos, investment analyst. So let's start by having a look at the US dollar because it appears to end the year and the decade on a high note. Do you think it can keep up this trend in 2020?
Well, first of all, let's start by discussing what the rest of the market thinks. So from the strategists that I have been reading at least, many of them are calling for losses in the US dollar over 2020. And the argument, or the thesis rather, is that we've had a ceasefire on trade. At the same time, we've seen the global economy exhibit some signs of recovery. We've had it slowing down lately, but now it looks to be picking up again. And both of those are, let's say, diminishing the dollar's safe haven appeal. Now, at the same time, there's a US election coming up next year, and many are saying that, that we might see a political risk premium added to the dollar due to the uncertainty involved with that election. Now, all of these are valid arguments. However, I'm not really in the camp that is forecasting losses in the dollar next year, and my thinking is, if you are not in the US, rather, where else outside of the US do you hide? Europe, growth there is almost stagnant. Interest rates are negative, a very similar situation is true in Japan, and emerging markets are extremely risky in an unstable trading environment globally. So I don't see much alternative outside of the US economy, and for the dollar to really weaken over the coming years, I think we would need to see either of two things. Either the Fed has to cut rates much more aggressively than it has already, which doesn't look likely at this point, or the euro area needs to announce a fiscal spending package that boosts growth there and therefore boosts the euro, and that weakens the dollar by extension. I don't think either of this is likely over the first half of the year at the least. And while we might see US election uncertainty eventually hurt the dollar, that will really depend on who the Democratic presidential nominee will be.
Well, you mentioned the euro area earlier, so let's have a look at the euro, which did have a troublesome 2019, and it's ending the year with growth bottoming out. What is the outlook for the euro in 2020?
I would argue it's not bright. Yes, you're right, growth seems to be bottoming out in the euro area, but it's bottoming out at a very low level. It's barely positive, so there isn't much to celebrate there. Now, at the same time, monetary policy in the euro area is exhausted. The ECB has already printed and cut rates negative and so on, so it can't really do that much more to boost growth. What the euro area really needs right now is a fiscal spending package that will boost growth, but the only nation that has the capacity to do that is Germany, and Germany has been really clear that it doesn't want to spend money, or at least even if it does, it's not going to be a significant spending package. So I would argue, well, at the same time, I should mention, we also have trade risks. Now that the White House has a ceasefire with China, it might turn its sights to Europe. The US president has long argued that, that there's a trade imbalance with Europe that needs to be corrected. We've seen some similar comments echoed by the top US trade representative lately, so I wouldn't be all that surprised to see Trump turn his attention to the Eurozone next year in terms of tariffs. Now, finally, there's also Brexit. We will discuss this in a little bit, but I think that eventually the risk of a no-deal Brexit comes back on the table, and that is also negative for the euro.
Well, speaking of Brexit, that was my next question, because it's impossible to talk about 2019 without Brexit.
Indeed.
It appears that we will have Brexit talks again in 2020. Do you think a trade deal can be reached by the December 2020 deadline? And what is the outlook for the pound? How will it perform?
I don't really think we're going to get a trade deal. Well, so for our viewers, the next stage of the Brexit negotiations that will begin in January will be negotiating the trading relationship, but the details of the trading relationship. Now, they have 11 months to do that. The same negotiation took the EU and Canada 7 years to negotiate. So it's not impossible, but it's not probable either, in my opinion. So what's likely to happen to the pound? I think that we'll see the currency kick the year off on a high note. The Brexit process will seem like it's moving forward. The negotiations will resume. We might even see some progress. But eventually, I think that the drama will return, especially as the deadline approaches. I think that the drama and the brinksmanship and the no-deal Brexit threats will eventually come back on the table, and that will eventually bring the British currency back under selling pressure. Now, another point arguing the same direction is the Bank of England. The Bank of England has lately shown some signs that it might cut rates in the coming year, and indeed the economy is pretty fragile, so we might see monetary policy work against the pound eventually as well.
And now let's have a look at a safe haven, because the yen had a turbulent year. It appears that the calm in the US-China trade war, as well as the calm, let's say, in Brexit, have hurt the currency. Do you think it will rebound in 2020?
Well, I think you nailed it right on the head. We've really seen the yen weaken lately. Two of the biggest risks facing the global economy, Brexit and the trade war, have subsided, and that has led to some losses. Now, does that continue? I think it does early in the year. I think we're going to see a better tone both with trade, both with Brexit at the beginning of the year. But eventually, like I just mentioned, a no-deal Brexit might come back on the table. And at the same time, I think the US election, well, depending on who the Democratic nominee is in the US election, that might help the yen regain some ground as well. So specifically, if we see one of the progressives take the nomination, so Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, they're calling for higher business taxes, their nomination will probably hurt stocks and therefore lead to a broader risk-off environment, which is also beneficial for safe havens like the yen. So we might see the yen have a cold beginning to the year, let's say, but we might eventually see it warm up again.
I see. Marios, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
I hope you have a happy new year.
You too.
And thank you for joining us here at XM.com.